Good. Well, today, May 28th, 1986, we have the privilege of interviewing Dr. Carl Hammer, who has done such pioneering work in the fields of computers. And it's a real pleasure, therefore, to present Dr. Hammer, who will give us an insight into the background which made all this possible. So with this, will you please proceed?
Yes, thank you. The background that made this all possible was that I was born in Chicago, and I just celebrated my 72nd birthday a few weeks ago. And my parents, who were German immigrants, were very conscientious about this. So they taught me as a bilingual. So I learned German with a German accent as a child and learned English with a German accent. And of course, the German with a German accent is not very noticeable. So my English accent is, my German accent, English is a put-on, which derives from the years from 1914 to 1920. In the 1920 to 1926 frame, my parents decided I should go back to Germany and get my education over there. So I got all my formal training and schooling in Germany.
Even starting out with your elementary?
Even elementary school, yes.
Oh, yes.
From 1920 to 1924 in a little town south of Munich, which is the capital of Bavaria. The town is called Starnberg. There's a lake there. And so I became a long-distance swimmer at an early age, which I still do. I still can swim a mile non-stop in about 55 minutes. It's a little more than it used to be.
Yeah, that's a real accomplishment.
And then eventually I ended up at the University of Munich, and I just last year celebrated my 50th anniversary of the approval of the faculty of my proposal for a PhD thesis. In 1935, I proposed to the faculty I should write a PhD thesis on a very obscure topic in probability theory. It was the inversion of Bernoulli's theorem, which nobody had ever looked at. The inversion Bernoulli's theorem, as you will know, deals with the number of successes and failures in an experiment which has P and Q as probabilities of success and failures. So if you make 1,000 experiments, then you expect to get so many, have a probability distribution for that. And I raised the opposite question, which nobody ever raised before. How many experiments do I have to make so that I can confidently expect I will have 55 successes or some other number? And it turns out that it's a total parallel to Bernoulli's theorem, and it turns out to be very interesting. All the theorems can be proven very nicely, and they look very much, even the formalism is the same. And so I published my thesis in 1938 and got the hell out of there. For obvious reasons, the war was right at the doorstep. And then I returned to the United States, and from then on I worked here. Initially, from 1938 to 1942, I worked at Texaco, their research laboratories.
Oh yes, what type of work did you do there?
I did mostly mathematical statistics, and yes, I forgot to mention, I'm glad you bring this up. One of the things that the Germans did very thoroughly was they trained me in numerical work. Only the Germans can do this, I mean, as efficiently as they do it. They had courses in hand calculation, that is, with logarithm tables, 7-place logs, and exercises. And so one of the things we did, in fact, in the middle 30s, I guess it was, we calculated orbits. I took astronomy as one of my subjects. And so it took us 1 semester to calculate the orbits of a star. And nowadays, on a computer, I can do this in about 100 milliseconds. It's terrible, waste of time. And that was one of the excursions. The other excursion I took was cryptography. That's really what got me interested in computers later on. So my ability to do hand computations as required in astronomy and my interest in cryptography, both were the motivating forces later on that got me really into the computer industry.
Oh yes, well, of course, in the computer industry, these things are done so much more easily than they could ever be done by hand calculations. But that discipline that you get by doing those hand calculations, I think, leads to a greater understanding and appreciation of the data.
Yeah, that has been confirmed. That's a good observation of yours, Clarence. That has been confirmed by many people who have done as much hand computation as I have. In a way, I followed the footsteps of Gauss and Bessel and all the others, who spent all their lives with 5, 6, 7, and more place log tables. And when you do these calculations yourself, even later on when I did them with mechanical calculators, you gain a much greater insight into these patterns, into relationships of those numbers. And if one of them falls out of place, then you realize that something has gone wrong. Whereas on a computer, as we found out much later, that people don't have that experience unless they're trained themselves. But that's almost a lost art in computation.
That's very interesting. Yeah. So then you did this work. Let's see, what organization was it?
Texaco.
Texaco.
Yeah. They, of course, they have a research laboratory up in Beacon, New York. It's 60 miles north of New York City. And obviously the war was on the doorsteps, so they needed all kinds of talent. And of course they had a large number of chemists, a large number of engineers, because to build, to do the chemistry work they were doing, they needed also some experimental cars. So they built all kinds of interesting new kinds of motor systems up there. And since I'd worked at the University of Munich also with mechanical engineering, that was an ideal place for me to be at. So for 5 years I worked there, and I left there in 1943 and moved to New York City to work at Columbia because I had an opportunity to work there. And so from then on, from 43 to 51, I stayed at New York City. And the most interesting work, of course, was the one I did at Columbia. I also had some commercial jobs. I worked for a while for Pillsbury, and I worked for a while. They did some operations research. We rediscovered linear programming, Motzkin and Danzig's linear programming algorithm, independently, of course. They already proved it, so no great glory in that, to do transportation systems. And of course, this was all done for the purpose of the war, mostly logistics. And that is at the time when at Columbia, of course, I got first acquainted with two major concepts which I found very interesting from a theoretical viewpoint. One was systems complexity. Let me steal my own thunder, if I may. A few years after I got interested in that, I ran into these guys called Eckert and Mauchly, and they had decided to build a computer out of 18,000 vacuum tubes.
Oh, yes.
And the largest systems in 1941, 42, 43 with vacuum tubes were, of course, in use in the telephone companies, and had about 300 tubes in those. And the argument that was quite frequently given, including by John von Neumann, was that the jump from 300 tubes systems complexity to 18,000 tubes systems complexity was larger than any engineer could swallow, and therefore the system couldn't possibly work. Von Neumann initially was, as you know, was quite negative about it. And of course, Eckert and Mauchly just simply said, well, there's a war on, so we can't be bothered with that nonsense. And I'll come back to it in a minute when I tell you how we did it. But you see, they used many organizations, not only the University of Pennsylvania, where they were, they used also Columbia University and other engineering laboratories as sounding boards. So we got involved in some of these very esoteric discussions, and that was item number one. And item number two was quality control. Namely, this was really Eckert. Mauchly was sort of a theoretical type, but Eckert said, well, it's very simple. To make that system work, we will not select any old art radio tubes, but we'll select them from the production line so that they meet very narrow standards of performance.
Oh, yeah.
And that was a concept that was first proposed by Carl Chambers, whom I met twice in my career. He was the head of the laboratory in the University of Pennsylvania in the Moore School, and he had produced this concept of quality control and mathematical statistics, which was, of course, my own alley. I did, in fact, the Mill Standard 105A during the war, which it still is the standard, the testing of squibs, fuses, and detonators. In the end of the war, I was the most knowledgeable person in this country about squibs, fuses, and detonators.
Oh, yes.
Don't ask me what they are. I know what they are, but it's. But it was sort of exciting. At any rate, you have to test them by destructive testing, and towards the end of the war, of course, they came with very strange requests. They said we must have some arrangement whereby these squibs and fuses, detonators must give you a probability of 0.9999999, I don't know how many, functioning. And we said, first of all, we said it can't be done. They said, well, do it, and then we got the marching orders. And so we did a very complicated thing there. We divided the devices, these are small devices, little things. into large batches made at different times, and then random sampled from them, and then destructive testing on batches of 100. And if 98 of them functioned, then we took the 2 left over and put them in a little other bucket. And then, so we tested these in batches of 100. And then after a while, we had a few hundred left over, knowing that then we tested those few hundred left over in other batches. And then finally, we had something like 5 left over, and we random sampled those. And then we used, I think, 3 in parallel. And later on, when we found out what we were doing, most of us sort of were shuddering, because obviously they were used for Fat Boy.
Yes. So, and of course, they needed
we didn't know that.
Symmetrical explosion.
Not only that, but you needed a guarantee that would work.
Yes.
I'm sure our heads were on the line there. But anyway, and so, but by this time, of course, the ENIAC was already making progress. As you know, it was not finished before the end of the war.
Yes,
the ENIAC was operational in 1946. Well, some people claim 45, but 46. But certainly in 46, the ENIAC was operational, and it proved these 2, let me say, operational principles that Eckert had laid down, namely the quality control on the tubes, and secondly, of course, that you can build systems with larger complexity. You do not have to jump 1 order of magnitude, you can jump 2 orders of magnitude, and maybe even more, if you design the systems right.
Yeah. That's a fascinating development there.
Yeah, and oh, absolutely. And of course, you see, from then on, I did most of my work. From then on, you might say, in the analysis, I never got involved in design work, really. That wasn't my bag, although I did some engineering work, but I try to avoid that. I like to work with paper and pencil, and then later on, of course, with the computers. And so the problems that then came to our attention were usually of the colossal kind. And maybe that's the fascination of computers.
Yes, well, of course, you're able to, with this new technique using digital computers, you're able to handle problems you couldn't even conceive of handling before.
Yeah, and one of them, of course, one class of these problems would be cryptography.
Yes.
And so,
so you had an interest in cryptography at a very early stage then.
Yeah, I was in that scene. I'm 44. I was 30 years old, and so at age 30, of course, Eckert and Mauchly were younger than I. No, Mauchly was older. He was 8 years older than I am. He died, of course, several years ago. Eckert is 2 years younger, or 3 years younger than I am. So I was sort of in the middle of that group.
Oh, yes.
Like many of them were college professors, and that would be essentially the age group I was in.
So then, so you did this early work, collaborating in the development of the ENIAC, and then you made use of that at Columbia also?
Oh, yes. Of course, Columbia had what they call the T.J. Watson computing laboratory there, and named after T.J. Watson from IBM, who donated 1 copy of every machine they ever built.
Oh, yes.
To the laboratory there. And, of course, earlier, before I came there, those machines were card punch machines.
Yes.
But whatever IBM built, they always gave 1 copy of the machine to the T.J. Watson laboratory. And so we had a card punching calculator there in 1946. I think it was 46 or 47. And I had run into some interesting problems which go today under the category called factor analysis, which is a matrix of correlation coefficients. And we could reduce by hand those things if the matrix was 10 by 10, but beyond that was totally impossible. And so there was a man whose name has eluded me, I can't think of it right now, but he is the father of factor analysis. And he came to Columbia and he said he would like to work with our machines there and with the card punching calculators. And so we said, well, but it won't work because, you know, they're not programmable. Why is this? What we're going to do is we'll feed millions of cards through the machine system. And then every time we make a run, we punch out output cards from a bunch of boxes from input cards. And we just keep on doing this until the thing converges. And by George, it worked. but we used up, I forgot, several million cards, which would be hundreds and hundreds of boxes. There's 2,000 cards in a box for any one run. But we did in 1946 or 47, we did the first factor analysis on a matrix, which was 100, by strange coincidence, 146 by 146.
That's amazing. Of course, in order to get a matrix, say, 8 by 8 or 10 by 10 by hand is fantastic.
10 by 10 is the limit.
Fantastic
hand,
job,
yeah.
and to do a matrix that size is amazing. So, well, then, how long do you stay at Columbia? Then,
I stayed there until 50 or 51. 50 or, I think 51. Yes, my wife graduated from Hunter College in 52, 51 I stayed there. And then in 51, I received a few inquiries from something called the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. And they had gotten a contract from the military dealing with analog computers. Mm-hmm. Now, I knew very little about analog computers. That was never really up my alley. I had seen the Harvard Mark I, Mark II, Mark III, Mark IV machines, which were, of course, relay machines. Mm-hmm. And I knew what they were doing. And that looked to me like that. But the military in those days was very much concerned with the complexity of these large systems. And of course, there was one successor to the ENIAC, the BINAC, which was supposed to be airborne, which is like taking your lovely home here and making it airborne.
Oh yeah,
weighing tons and tons and tons of transformers and transistors, and no, that's before transistors, and resistors and all kinds of things, and obviously like another 10,000 or 20,000 tubes, and the thing was never airborne. That's the BINAC. Right. But of course, Eckert and Markley in those days were already talking about reduction in physical size of those machines. So I simply left that to the experts in the engineering field and simply said, well, if these machines are going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, we can solve problems which are larger and larger and larger. And so I paid very little attention to that. But the main point here was that the Franklin Institute at that time was more interested in analog computers, largely because the military said these digital machines will never be as simple as the analog computers, of which we had some good ones and of which we had an excellent knowledge. I remember Reeves Company in New York, they were building analog computers which are colossal. One of the machines that, in fact, I was the assistant director at the Franklin Institute at the time for this, one of the machines we had in there was a Reeves computer built to simulate the entire electrical network in the Allegheny region, which is Philadelphia and all the environments all the way up to the mountains. There were like 8 or 10 electric companies, and of course, these electric networks are linked. And they pipe electricity, so to speak, from one network to another when an overload occurs. It's all fully automatic, and but you cannot control it unless you have a mechanism for controlling it, and that is your simulation.
Oh, yeah.
Now, this network analyzer that they had in the Franklin Institute there was the world's largest at the time. Mm-hmm. I think they had 50 units in that thing. It was colossal, larger than this room.
Yes, and those were analog.
These were analog computers, and that's all that was required.
Yes.
And later on, we heard that this was during the 55 period when the Russians were launching Sputnik, that the Russians, in fact, had decided early in the game to stick with analog computers because they didn't need any more accuracy. For guidance and control, you don't need more than that. Whereas our own decision, of course, was to go digital.
Yes.
But to come back to this point, if I may, the military in the late 40s, early 50s were not convinced that digital computers were here to stay. Although we got some contracts out of them. But analog computers, they were sure they were going to make it.
Yeah. Of course, at that time, I believe MIT was one of the leaders in the analog computer.
They had that huge machine up in there with all the wheels and the integrators.
And they really influenced quite a number of work, particularly the military, probably, because
many of the military came out of MIT.
MIT and so forth. So I guess it wasn't until quite a bit later that MIT went to the digital computer, concentrated on that rather than analog. But that's very
Yeah, and I tell you, I'm a Machiavellian by nature. I brought this out for a reason, because early in the development of these machines, I saw different patterns developing than most people did. And I'll come back to that in a little while, because I'm fighting a winning battle. I don't fight losing battles, I fight a winning battle. But it's going to take me another 10 years to win this battle right now against the established community in the data processing world who think they know all the answers, but they have to learn a lot before the next 10 years are over.
Yes, well, this such a complex field. I imagine there's a good deal of controversy in various as to which direction to go in.
Well, yeah, the controversy actually was started by von Neumann. And nowadays, the funniest thing is to pick up a scientific journal and find an abbreviation called non-VONs, N-O-N-VON. A non-VON is a machine which is not built along the lines that von Neumann proposed. All machines obviously had to be built. And obviously to him, not to anybody else, I guess. And there were some of us who questioned that. And one of them was that all machines had to be general-purpose machines. And secondly, every machine had to be a sequential machine. And it turns out that both of them are wrong. Because it turns out even the earliest machines were not general-purpose machines. They were, each machine, after we had designed it, we found out, was optimal against a very narrow class of problems. And if you widened the class, the machine became less optimal. And that means in the end, of course, there were some problems you couldn't solve on those machines, on any one machine. So we, even early in, we built front ends, communication front end computers, but nobody drew the consequence of that. Says, but isn't that against von Neumann? And I made speeches about this all the time. And he was an old crank, I was told. No, I said, that's not, you see, that the point is, that von Neumann was absolutely correct from his viewpoint. But we have advanced far beyond that, and so there will always be, from here on out, a very large number of very special purpose machines, which you then glue together, if you will, to obtain or to build a system which solves many kinds of problems. But certainly, the idea that every computer has to be a general purpose machine, that is out the window. And then second, of course, the other maxim that he proposed was that it be sequential machines. And of course, we no longer do that. We now build parallel machines, we build data flow machines, all kinds of other devices. And but that essentially was the 40-year history from 1944 to 1984.
Of course, von Neumann must have been influenced quite a bit by the fact that in his day, memory was so very expensive, and today. Memory is not very expensive, and so you have much more freedom to design machines, probably.
Yeah, those writings, by the way, of his I'm talking about, which appear in the Annals of the History of Computing, were writings before even the machines were built. These were writings which came out of his mind, so to speak, as he was looking at the Harvard Mark I, Mark II, Mark III, Mark IV relay computers.
Oh, yes.
Or as he was looking at the MIT analog computers, the big ones, which Vannevar Bush and others, of course, had designed and built beautifully, and some pieces of which are still in existence in some museums. But when Eckert Mauchly and these other people came to him and proposed to build this machine with 18,000 valves, alias tubes, depends on what part of the ocean you come from, the ideas he then laid down included those two I mentioned, namely all machines had to be general purpose machines and all machines had to be sequential. And of course, it turned out that was not true. In fact, we know better now. But so I get a chuckle out of this every time I see these more recent papers in the IEEE journals about the non-VONs.
Oh, yes.
He left his footprint there. It was a very big footprint.
Yes. Because we always used to refer to them as Johnniacs, the ones that are.
Well, the Johnniac, of course, was a machine that was built for the Rand Corporation.
Yes,
it was operational in Santa Monica.
Yeah. Well, that's fine. So then you then joined what was it, Sperry Rand?
At that time, it was called the Remington Rand.
Remington Rand.
Remington Rand. Yeah, that was 1955.
Yes.
And by this time, of course, I had been working in Philadelphia, which was right next door to to the Remington Rand people where they were building the Univac ones. And Eckert and Mauchly, of course, had made their point, which, again, was one of those things which took a long time to sink in, because when the first machines were built, Clarence, both in this country and in all countries in the world, all the first machines were one of a kind and usually sponsored by the government, I think with no exception. Whether it's in the Soviet Union, they built the Beijing, all these other machines there, but the first machines were all one of a kind. Until we had learned a little bit more about how to organize these the architectures, and, in a very generic sense. And Eckert and Mauchly, very early, right after the ENIAC and the BINAC, they said, look, this is sheer nonsense. What made this country great is the automobile industry, or is the Colt revolver industry, replaceable parts, mass production. And they were trying to sell the idea to the government that the government ought to fund this, and they were going to build not one Univac one, not two, they were going to build a dozen.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, the story has made the rounds before, and I forgot where it's published, but it's allegedly very true, that somebody in the government then estimated the whole world needed no more than 6 computers.
Oh, yes.
Of that class. And of course, I have a pocket Casio, not in the suit, but at home, which is the same capacity as the ENIAC.
Yes, a fantastic development.
And so certainly we need more than 6, but they fought this battle and they won that battle eventually. That's a history all by its own. It's incredible. The name Minna Reese comes to mind, and a few others, because Eckert and Mauchly had founded the Eckert and Mauchly Computer Corporation, and they went bankrupt. And so they had to find a sponsor while they were building the Univac. And so they found a sponsor. Well, they went to everybody they could think of. I'm not going to mention any companies, because they went to every company you could think of. And they all said no. And the last company they went to was Remington Rand. And they found this guy, Art Draper, whom I remember well. Art Draper was the acquisition man. And so he made them a very bad deal, but it's the only Hobson's choice, the only deal they got. So they took it. And so they got bailed out. So the Univac one was finished and delivered to the Census Bureau. And but in the meantime, of course,
what year was that they
51.
delivered that?
It went operational. The inauguration was, I think, on June the 20th, 51.
Oh, yeah,
something like that, plus or minus.
That was...
And in fact, in a little while, there will be the 35th or 40th anniversary. Was it 51 and 86? Yeah, 35th anniversary. It's going to be in June. I am going to be there.
Oh, yes. That's a fascinating story of the development of that. And so you joined Univac or Sperry Rand when it was expanding in this field. Then,
yes, and of course they found out I had this German accent, and with which had started our discussion here. And they said, "Well, you speak German." I said, "Well, fluently." So they said, "Well, you speak German, you speak English, you speak Univac. Why don't we hire you, and you move to Germany?" So they were going to install a service bureau with a Univac one in Frankfurt.
Oh, yeah.
And we did that. I had to build a building first. The Univac was a big machine. They didn't have a building big enough over there. So we put up a building in 54, 55. The machine got moved in the summer of 56 and went operational in October 56, and I came back in 57.
Oh, yes.
And in 57, of course, that is when I defected. I decided I had enough of this Remington Rand outfit. And it is amusing that today is the date when it was announced that Sperry had been acquisitioned by Burroughs.
Oh, yes, that's right. That was in the papers.
Today is the day. Michael Blumenthal has done it. At any rate, so here I came back, and of course, I had all kinds of choices. But so I cast, a few crumbs in the water, and I got an inquiry from Sylvania and from RCA, which I followed up.
Oh, yes.
They were building some huge systems for the military. And I always liked these large systems because they're more of a challenge than some of the commercial applications. Although the commercial applications of today is a different story. But, so we went and we built this ballistic missile early warning system. That was the first one. And then we built the Minuteman guidance and control system and launch system, the second one. And I did that in the period from 57 to 61. Now, there are some interesting things about that, because ballistic missile early warning system, BMUs, we used an IBM 709, which was later on replaced by an IBM 7090 and then by 94s, in 3 northern sites where they had these huge radars. And the IBM 709, of course, was not designed as a real-time computer. And so what we had to do is we had to design a system. The software was, and the analysis was all right, but we had designed a system where a computer, which was not basically real-time, could be used in a real-time environment. And that was a hair-raising experience.
Yeah. Let's see, that was, they used the 709 for that?
That was 709, yeah.
Was that a vacuum tube?
The 709 was the last
vacuum
tube machine, yes. They still had about 6,000 tubes in there. They had replaced many of the others by diodes, so they looked like tubes, but they were diodes. And but it was the last big machine.
Oh, yes.
And then, of course, in the northern sites, they put 2 dual 7090s, which were later on replaced by 7094s.
Yes, well, and you got into the big machine field there with that experience.
I always was in the mainframe area. Of course, today a mainframe is a very large PC.
Yeah.
And you can do almost anything you want to. And then the next assignment was the Minuteman communications network, which linked all the silos in the various places wherever they have them. And we had to design, and that involved also encryption, so we had to design a very secure operational system which allowed all the computers in that network to talk to each other constantly. I shouldn't say each other, to one another constantly. All of them were talking to all each other. And so there was a steady traffic of digital communications between all these machines, and of course it was all encrypted, so when you looked at it you didn't see any patterns, but there was content in it, and so that was an interesting design.
Yes, well so you constantly made use of your early interest in
mathematics, statistics, probability theory, and cryptography. And they're still, to this very day, they're still there, motivate me. There's some interesting things I'm doing right now, and but they involve particularly the cryptography and the probability theory.
Oh yes. Well, let's see. With the RCA built quite a number of machines for the military. Then
not only, also commercial machines, 301, 501, 601.
Yes.
And I stayed with them until 1962, and they moved me to Washington. I was working out in New York with RCA at the time, and they finally decided they would move me to Washington in 61, I guess. And so I stayed in Washington in 61, 62. And then I decided that they were never going to make it. This is a story all by itself, because they had a very senior vice president, Ed McAllister, whom I remember well, and he had just come from Univac. In these computer companies, they hire vice presidents if they want somebody to do something. So RCA had hired him to head up the computer operations. And of course, I was with RCA at the time, and so I said hello to Ed. I knew him from my Univac days, and I looked at what they were doing, and I said, "This can't work."
Well, that's quite amazing, because ordinarily you'd think that with all the background of electronics and technology of various kinds that RCA had, they would be a natural for being on the advancing edge of technology. Far better chance to make it work than Remington Rand or IBM or any of these, actually.
No, IBM knows what they're doing. They knows what they're doing. There's no question about that. But and let me say, they do that for two reasons. One, they're experts in marketing. They don't tackle anything unless they can really market it. They plan their moves very carefully. And secondly, they're experts in management. And outsiders don't realize how tightly controlled they are, but they are tightly controlled inside. I know quite a few of their people well. Now, the problem here is that I saw in the industry as a whole, it dates back to the good old days of General Electric, when GE had this maxim that if you can manage anything, if you can manage one thing, then you can manage anything. A manager is a manager is a manager. And that is not true. It is specifically not true in the computer industry because a computer industry manager is totally dissimilar from managing a machine shop.
That's a very interesting point.
And General Electric really went out of the computer industry at the same time when RCA went out, because they didn't understand the problem of management. Now, I spent much of my career from the, I would say from the 60s on, when I returned to Sperry, I would say not doing battle with management, but trying to enlighten management on the differences between managing in the good old days and managing in the days of computers. My joke about it was BC and AD. Management BC means obviously before computers, and AD means after those damn machines. And if you spice it up with little homilies like that, then managers swallow that. And I've continued that until I retired in '81. I'm still doing this. I serve on a number of government committees and private and industry committees and boards. And my interest is, it has not changed and wavered at all, is to continue along those lines and tell managers what they're overlooking. And it's usually obvious.
Oh, yes.
And maybe I can now take about 2 or 3 minutes and tell you the obvious.
Well, that would be very, as a matter of fact, it's very interesting the different ways in which modern science and technology has been managed, and sometimes very well, like Hewlett-Packard, and then on the other hand, you find failures in big areas like General Electric and RCA failed in the computer field. And do you have any pertinent observation as to why this happened and what mistakes? Is there any generality there?
Well, I mentioned already one, that's a style of management.
Yes.
The success stories, including Hewlett-Packard and many others, the success stories are typical American success stories. They are the entrepreneurism.
Oh, yes.
America is great. America is still a very fertile ground for entrepreneurs. When you stifle the entrepreneur, then you stifle progress. In my own company, for example, in Sperry, I saw we had Bill Norris. He came from ERA, Engineering Research Associates in Minneapolis, and a top-notch engineer. And he had in the early 50s, I guess, I met him 52, in the early 50s, he had an idea that he would like to build a very large machine for the military. And of course, Remington Rand had merged with ERA, so he was now working for Remington Rand. And they wouldn't let him. They said there's no market for that. Again, the missing link is the marketeer.
Oh, yeah.
There is a market for that. He was right. And so he just left the company and found his own company, Control Data, and the machine was the 1604, and it was immediately a success. I tell you what he did, though. He sold the machine as hardware only, no software.
Oh, that is interesting.
No software. And maintenance, yes, but no software. And so it turns out that was a very good move, because the military bought hundreds of those machines, and they all set out to write their own software. And enormously complex and successful systems and applications were developed under that concept. And then later on, he did the same thing again when Seymour Cray built the Cray 1, Cray 2, and other machines, and the Cybers. Many of those, well, the earliest was 6600. Many of those were sold, for example, to Livermore without software. And then Livermore wrote the 6600 software.
Yeah. Of course, you had very talented people, both in the military and at Livermore and so on, who could write
incredible
software.
And nobody gives them credit for that. And the talent is there. And they will do it and they can do it. So all of this essentially is a matter of synergism, which simply says the computer industry and the users have to form a synergistic relationship, so that the users participate actively in the design development, for example, of applications and software, while the mainframers or whatever expend their energy on the design of the hardware.
Oh yes. Well, that's very, very interesting there.
And where that cynicism, of course, was most noticeable was in the case of IBM, with whom I dealt extensively when I did the ballistic missile early warning system, because I had some enormous orders in with IBM for 7090s and 94s.
Yes. Well, those are some fascinating experiences that you had during that very active development period, and of course those were essentially at that time, I believe there weren't most things you might say all mainframe, rather at least large for its time. There weren't many intermediate or smaller, and then
well, there were some. DEC, of course, was the pioneer with the PDP.
Oh yes,
but initially everybody said, "Well, they never make it."
Yes,
and of course Olson and a few others whom I happen to know decided they are going to make it, and they did too.
Yes.
DEC is now a multi-billion-dollar corporation.
Yes,
and doing quite well. Thank you, they always say to me.
Yes, well, those PDPs certainly.
Oh,
they got installed all over the whole world,
right?
And essentially broadened the number of users of computers
and created loyalty. I mean, DEC users are the loyalty pronest bunch I ever knew.
Oh yes.
I mean, those people. DEC can't do anything wrong.
Oh yes.
So, IBM wished they could say the same thing, but the DEC people, there's nothing they can do wrong.
Yeah. They had some fabulous successes with those.
And they're continuing along the same road.
Yes. Yeah. Well, they certainly have a big piece of the business starting from a very small base there. In fact, I believe I heard.
Yeah, they did start with a backyard computer. Actually, yes. I think it was basement and a garage.
Basement and garage type of operation, and I think Olson said he was using aquarium tanks for some of the platings.
I wouldn't be surprised.
So those early days, putting together those first things, and that's a wonderful story of those early days.
Oh, but that's the interesting part of Clarence, about the entire computer industry, and that is that we live at a time. It's a fascinating time where you and I can sit here and we do remember what it was BC, before computers.
Oh yes, and now a lot of people just accept that it's always
if BC means before cars.
Yeah.
I don't mean impugn either your age or my age, but there are very few people around who were born before cars.
That's right.
And all right, before airplanes, well, the Lilienthal's were in the 1910s, but that's not airplane, that's gliders.
Yeah.
But flying, but before computers, there was nothing before 1946.
Right.
Because you cannot. The Harvard Mark machines, they were experiments, but obviously they were not for general use.
Yes.
But in the late 40s, let's say around the 1950 frame of time, it became apparent that computers would be here to stay. And if anybody had the foresight, some companies like IBM did, that there would be an enormous influence and there would be a huge market. And so we live at a time when many of the pioneers, both in your field and in mine, are still alive. You can still talk to them.
Yes, that's
and you can tape record them, as you do.
This is a very interesting part. Of course, so many fields of technology have developed over that very short time span.
If I may, for a moment, blow the horn of the computer industry. In fact, all the other technologies have only advanced because of computers. There is no way you could build a 747 nor fly it unless you had computers. Mm-hmm. There is no way whereby you could build atomic reactors nowadays or run them or manage them and operate them without having computers. Mm-hmm. Whatever technology you look at, even the automobile now becomes a computerized automobile.
Yeah.
And it will continue that way. So it's more than pervasive. It is fundamental. And provides the industry, all arms of the industry worldwide, this extra power, which says they can now design machines in fact, is a closed loop. We design the large computers now with computers. We design the layout of the VLSI chips with computers. It is a task that a human being cannot fulfill.
That's an amazing thing. The machines are
totally impossible.
Designing machines there.
Right. And that's before artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And so, if you look at the famous technology curves, which are these ogives, we're still down here.
Yeah. And
we're still down here.
It's absolutely fascinating what has come out of all of this. Yeah. So in recent years, then you've I guess you've broadened your interest in industry, government, and education, all kinds of fields. I was wondering what sort of comments you have on your more recent activities.
Yeah, my recent activity in the last 4 or 5 years, I would say, has been pattern recognition, pattern analysis.
Oh, yes.
It simply says, what have I seen in those 50 years since computers have arrived on the scene of a crime, if you will, and what have I learned? And therefore, what can I tell managers who are now beginning to start in management or future managers? And I find that they're all too close to their own operations. They don't see the big picture. And that is what is so amazing. And management, if it were enlightened, would in fact see that, let me make some statements here, that they had to give up a good deal of their authority already to the machine. The decision-making process of the manager of today is carried to some extent already by the machine. The machine decides many things, and the manager has given up the power to make those decisions completely to the machine. For example, simple example, when I was a youngster, payroll was always checked by hand because payroll was done by hand.
Oh, yes, surely.
I cannot imagine the vice president of General Motors checking the payroll. Computer does it. He assumes that the payroll comes out all right because his people have done the job, and it does come out all right. There may be some ghosts on the payroll, but that's a minor problem. So these colossal tasks are done by the machine, and the manager already has given up the prerogative to interfere. The machine is carrying that load.
That's a very, very interesting concept. I think before we go further, suppose we pause here a moment. All right, well, now will you please proceed with these very interesting remarks that you've made there.
Yeah, let me sharpen them a little bit. What I've described essentially is the transition that brought the computer into operational use for the benefit of engineers, scientists, teachers, and managers. And in this transition, we now spent more than 30 years learning all about data processing. And of course, as I said before, the managers have already given up a good deal of their authority to the machine, and simply because they know the machine can do all this work and that they can make 35 million Social Security checks within a few days every month and mail them out, and maybe the post office loses them, but they can do that. They can calculate orbits in milliseconds, which used to take us hours and hours, if not weeks. And so the colossal power of the machine is felt everywhere. But what I'm going to call this now is actually that is management's or the decision maker's first dilemma. And that is, he has fallen into a trap unwittingly and simply acknowledged the superiority of the machine in those areas where we're doing data processing. And data processing, of course, means doing payroll, doing inventory, running programs which were designed by a human being on the machines at the time when the human beings want to run these programs. The schedule is made by a manager. And that is the crucial problem, because man is in his capacity as manager or user, is interacting with a machine system. Now, basically, if you ignore the problems of software, basically the machine system doesn't make any mistakes. We can write software today that is error-free, that can be checked out. It's costly, but it can be done. But the human beings interacting with those machines are the ones who make all the mistakes. And so the dilemma that I'm driving at now is going to be that dilemma that the managers have already given up their power over data processing to the machine. They must now also give up their power over procedural processing to the machine. And I'll give you a few little examples of this. Procedural processing is basically what we do in everyday life as managers as we proceed in carrying out our duties. That involves, for example, filling out forms. 1040 is a fine form. Everybody in this country knows what 1040 is. But 1040, logically speaking, is a procedure. And you cannot fill out that form in any random manner. You have to follow very precisely a procedure, step by step. In fact, it's a back and forth procedure if you have a very complicated 1040. And I have a former student of mine in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and he estimated, they don't even know, that there's anywhere between 10 and 100 million logical steps in the complete 1040 procedure.
Fantastic.
And of course, H&R Block doesn't have more than 1% of that on their computers, because the total complication never arises. But basically, it's between 10 and 100 million logical steps, which means the IRS, we're talking about tax reform nowadays, but that's immaterial. The IRS has tried for years to actually convert these procedures into a logically complete and consistent system. It turns out that is where the problem is. The procedure itself is not logically consistent and complete. The Congress writes these laws, and the laws are contradictory.
Oh, yes.
But examining that from a logical viewpoint, one discovers then that the procedure itself is not even logical. It has to be modified. As a consequence of that, I'm using an example, it turns out that many people become victims of this interaction between men and machines, between men and computers, of course, I'm talking about. And I'll quote quickly some examples from the Washington area. The procedure of promoting a lieutenant commander to commander is a very well-established procedure done in the Navy every year. And it involves that the captain gets some personnel folders called jackets of the people who are to be promoted, and then the Navy sends out a letter to the lieutenant commander saying, you are being promoted to commander, and as of this date you can wear the 3 full stripes, but this will be confirmed after your jacket has been submitted for approval to the Congress. This is a formality. And so the Navy in the Washington area, like in other areas of the country, send out every year thousands of these letters. And last year, here in the Washington area, the captain who was in charge of one particular segment of the Navy said to his secretary to take those 300 folders and put them in her desk, and then when he needs them, he's then going to send them over to the Congress for approval. Well, the secretary retired, and she had done exactly what the captain had told her to do. She put those folders in her desk. And about a half year later, one of the lieutenant commanders said to another, hey, he says, did you ever get your letter from the Congress? No, I didn't get mine. Did you get yours? So, of course, they made one big mistake, and they went back to the captain. The captain says, oh my God, I forgot about the folders. And so they were still, the secretary retired, they were still in her desk. That's a very simple procedure.
Fantastic example.
This kind of thing, by the way, the term that was used in some newspapers was, have we ever defrocked any commander? They had to defrock 300 of them.
Oh, yeah, that's fantastic.
And it's so simple. Now, what I'm driving at here is that I can give you 100 more examples. I got a collection that's incredible. Always involves, and I give you the key points of these now, always involves some human beings who think they are in total control of the procedure. If they wouldn't make a mistake, they would be in total control of the procedure. But they make mistakes. 1984, in November, the IRS sent its quarterly tapes, which they do, from the regional office of Philadelphia to Martinsburg, West Virginia. Then Martinsburg takes those tapes and essentially distributes the data to the account numbers being Social Security numbers of the people from whom taxes have been withheld and for whom the employers and the employees themselves have made payments to the Social Security system. And this goes on all the time. I mean, these tapes arrive every quarter in Martinsburg. And Martinsburg got some tapes from Philadelphia in November of '84 and couldn't read them on a computer. And so they wrote a letter to Philadelphia, and the letter got lost in the mail or something. And it's a hair-raising story. At any rate, in March of '85, which is a little more than a year ago, the Martinsburg computer discovered, listen to this now, discovered there were 150,000 delinquent employers, taxpayers in the Philadelphia area who had not paid anything to the government in the last quarter.
Fantastic.
Not only that, but they sent out 150,000 docking letters. Not only that, they sent a sheriff after 10 of them to close up the shop before they got stopped, because everybody had canceled checks. Mm-hmm. And the computer simply says, I don't accept canceled checks, I am a computer.
That's fantastic.
The interaction between a procedural system such as this and the human beings is where all the errors occur. Mm-hmm. In the District of Columbia, we have a system whereby the schools receive fuel oil for the winter in fall, automatically. Mm-hmm. Except a year ago, several schools had changed their heating system and they delivered to them the wrong fuel oil. Nobody had told anybody about it. They had to pump it back out and clean the tanks.
Oh, fantastic.
17 schools. Now, I said I have a long list of these. I'm going to quit now. Yeah. But these are examples to show that we do know data processing. Martinsburg does know how to read those tapes if they have them. Philadelphia knows how to record the receipt of a check on these tapes if they have the check. The District of Columbia knows how to deliver fuel oil if you just tell them the right fuel oil. The lieutenant commanders will get promoted to commanders if the captain doesn't forget that the 300 folders are in the secretary's desk and she's retired. Yeah. The first dilemma was that managers had to give up the right, the privilege, the power of decision-making to some degree to the machine. And the second dilemma is going to be that management will now have to learn that any procedure that can be spelled out in technical terms, that has structure, must also be done by the machines. And the manager then essentially has only the function of monitoring and reading the reports from the machine that in fact the process is going on exactly as scheduled. The machine tells the manager, I'm doing this and this and this, just for information only. And the only way to avoid these disasters in Martinsburg and in the captain's desk and in the fuel oil tanks and 100 others or 1,000 others which occur daily in this country is to build machines in the future in which we not only do data processing, but in which we do procedural processing. And it is my contention and my earnest opinion that this has to precede artificial intelligence, because procedural processing is a very special type of expert system.
Yeah, but of course it's a very important function to be carried out, and it seems to me that it lends itself to a solution or even the techniques of random samplings and so forth would uncover a lot of procedural errors and so on.
Yes, yes and no. Most of the procedural errors are not systematic errors. They are one of a kind, one occurrence. The random sampling would not be sufficient. It has to be total sample.
So it have to be total.
Total sampling. And that's procedural processing. The machine has to simply do all the steps and inform managers that they are taking care of this according to the calendar. The dilemma then is that the industry right now is doing a lot of things in artificial intelligence. The word expert systems is going around. I happen to know Ed Feigenbaum quite well. He's a very good friend of mine. And we had this out in several debates so far. And privately, I guess he's admitting that I may have a point. The problem is that these procedural processes are in complexity at least 2 orders of magnitude over what we have ever done in data processing. And that brings me back to the first point I made in the interview. We are now back not building machines 2 orders of magnitude larger than machines we've ever built before, the 350 tubes of the Bell Lab systems vis-a-vis the 18,000 tubes of the ENIAC. But now we have to build systems which are 2 orders of magnitude beyond what we have ever been doing. And that is going to take many decades. That's going to take many headaches, many problems, many studies. It's not going to be easy. And before we take an IRS procedure, 1040 or whatever it's going to be called after the tax reform, is immaterial, and convert that into a computer system, that's going to be a 10-year project.
Yes, a fantastic complexity.
The complexity exceeds anything that man can ever achieve. And therefore we have to build machines to design their own systems.
Oh, yeah. So that's a fascinating thing bordering on artificial intelligence.
And the argument I have is that this is so large that we'll not be able to do this in less than 30 years.
Oh, yes.
It has taken us 30 years to learn all about data processing. I'm arguing it will take us another 30 years to learn all about procedural processing.
So we're not going to run out of problems in this particular field in the very near future.
The human society is a very complex system of its own, and it's creating more problems than it can solve.
Right.
That's the good news.
A wonderful exposition of this particular point. What are some of the other areas that you are concerned about or are working on and so on?
Well, of course, one area is still cryptography. And cryptography, of course, has totally changed under the impact of computers. When I started cryptography, Helen Gaines Fouché was the very famous textbook on cryptography. It's still the Bible for the amateurs of today. And it is what we today call classical cryptography, which is thousands of years old. But when the machine came, the computer came into being, and its power was realized by everybody, cryptography entered a new era, which is the non-classical cryptography, the cryptography after computers. Totally different from what we had done before, except the foundations are still the same. We're still doing transpositions and substitutions, but we're doing them maybe 1 million times in a row quickly, and thus have algorithms in a machine which no human being could possibly carry out by paper and pencil, but the machine can. On the other hand, it turns out that even the machines, certainly today and probably not in the future, are big enough to carry out all the things we would like to do. So we have come across the concept in that field that Kurt Gödel proposed many years ago, which is the concept of an unsolvable problem. And we do have problems today that we have analyzed, and where we have begun to understand that the problem is so large that if it has a solution, the solution to write it down would require every atom in the universe.
Fantastic.
And it is very difficult to sit down with a fountain pen or a high-speed printer and arrange all the atoms in the universe so that they look like paper and you can write things down. And, so we have reached some limits. Now these are absolute limits. There's nothing relative about this. There are some problems which are so colossal that we know that the the smallest solution, if anything, like is 10 to the 20th or 10 to the 30th power, which gets close to the number of atoms in the universe.
So yes, so that's
so there are some problems in the Gödelian sense. Gödel, of course, posed this as a logical dilemma, but there are some problems in the physical world which are numerical in that sense. That we know that there's no way for mankind ever to know that. There's, if you will, God has set some limits on what we can know.
And so, well,
that's one of the limits.
That's one of the limits, of course. Yes. Well, fine. Well, you certainly would. I think you mentioned someplace along the line the so-called artificial intelligence. What do you feel about the application of computers and artificial intelligence? I don't know quite how to explain.
Yeah.
What do you think? There's quite a bit of controversy as to what the future is for that. Would you care to say a few words on that?
Yes, I did stop there earlier. Let me now say what the difference between procedural processing and artificial intelligence is in some sense. Procedural processing is a logically complete and consistent system. There's nothing uncertain about it. There's no uncertainty principle in it. There is no probability in it. In other words, if a procedure, no matter how complex it is followed, then it will come without any doubt to a very specific response. And if somebody else follows the same procedure, it will come to the same response. The reason that is not sufficient is that some problems are not in the world of Boolean logic, but some problems in the world of fuzzy sets, which means the outcome is determined by probabilistic means rather than by deterministic means. Now, artificial intelligence will be very successful, in my opinion, once we have gone over this hurdle of building very large systems, which will include fifth-generation machines just to do the expert systems for procedural processing. And artificial intelligence will be very successful, in my opinion, in solving or assisting with the solution of all kinds of problems which have some semblance of structure. Now, if a problem has a high degree of structure, then we can solve it today, in fact. If a problem is ill-structured, well, but not too badly structured, then artificial intelligence will, in fact, provide a solution for that problem. But, of course, the ultimate barrier is if a problem, in fact, has no structure, artificial intelligence can't do anything with it. Again, that's the barrier put by, if you like, God, put there by God, or some infinite wisdom of the universe. And so management, essentially, in the next 100 years, will have to cope with that, and management has to decide to remove unstructured problems from the working table, because they have no solutions. We make decisions today frequently on the spur of the moment and on emotional bases. And of course, that is not good decision making. But sometimes we can't do better. The manager today says, I would like to have a system to aid me in making my decision. And cleverly enough, the people have come up with something called decision support systems. But a decision support system is only good in an environment in which, in fact, there is some semblance of structure. And if there's no semblance of structure, then you might just well toss a coin. And managers in the next 100 years will have to come to grips with that as a problem, because they simply have to give up some of their prerogatives so carefully obtained in the last 10,000 years, I guess, and simply say, well, we must put structure into the system. That means we have to give up something in return. Some degrees of freedom to which we are so accustomed now. This may be minor degrees, I don't know. but they will have to be sacrificed. You cannot yell fire in a movie house when it's packed. That's maybe the extreme, but that's what everybody cites.
Yes, that's a very good example of what you give up.
It seems to me that is not much to give up. But the purists say, I don't want to give up anything. I will argue against that. It won't work that way. We'll have to give up something. And it may turn out to be very, very easy to do. It may turn out that we can be very accommodating about this. I personally don't feel that there's much to be given up. But then I'm not an arch conservative, but I lead a very orderly life, so I have a feeling there's not much to be given up.
Well, that's a very interesting point there as to how computers are going to impinge more and more on decisions as we go along.
Yeah, and Clarence, let me add a number to this. I talked about sort of generically about data processing. If we tried to do today longhand in the United States alone, what is done by computers in the United States, we would need 5 trillion clerical workers. The total population of the world, as you know, is only 5 billion. Yeah. That gives you a measure. Yeah. There is no way whereby we can give up the work, the support of those machines of today. And that's only of today. Some years from now, we'll probably need 5 quadrillions of people to do the. So it turns out the amount of work these machines are doing is so colossal, is so enormous, that it far exceeds our ability even to think about it. And that is why the decision maker has to yield to the power of the machine. And that will continue when we come to procedural processing. And that will continue when we come to the elements of artificial intelligence which have structure.
That's a fascinating way that you put that, how these things are related, and it's of course it's astonishing that with those figures you gave us, it's obvious we can never go backwards on these things, because
we may be forced to.
There are not, however, enough human beings in the world to do all of these things that at least as of today's standards, we think need to be done. They're being done by computers.
Well, the calamity may occur. Yeah. It is not in the realm of impossibility that we will never have a nuclear war. I don't know about this. I would hope we wouldn't. But if it should occur, all communications will cease. All the things that our civilization has learned to depend upon, including the very limited means, say, in totally undeveloped countries in the middle of Africa, that will cease. And of course, then you're going to be back at ground zero.
Yes.
Very bad joke, of course. But if the world does not engage in such folly, suicidal folly as it may be, if not, then the progress with those machines will continue. And you will notice I've ignored totally hardware. Hardware just continues relentlessly along a semi-logarithmic path, and it doubles its capacity every 2 years or something like that. 1.4 per year. Yeah.
Fine. Well, those are mind-staggering concepts that you've given us here this afternoon, Carl, and I certainly want to thank you for this wonderful exposition you've given as to the role of computers yesterday, today, and in the future. This is a very fine contribution you've made. I really have enjoyed your hearing from you firsthand your ideas on this thing.
Thank you for inviting me.
Fine.